Look, this is insane. This is like talking about how good your car is by saying how much fuel you're using. Hey, it's Marek. This week I wanted to draw your attention to something that's been bugging me for a while. You know how whenever we have access to the most recent large language models, we always choose them for whatever task at hand. And yes, if there's an option to trigger deep thinking, deep reasoning, extended thinking, chain of thought reasoning, whatever it's called, we turn it on as well, right? We want the most advanced AI available to humanity to do our tasks, even if it's just choosing what to have for dinner on a Friday. So obviously, we need to start asking ourselves, does it make sense? And there's some recent research that seems to be suggesting that actually it makes even less sense than you thought it does. So let me just, before I dive into some of those very, very interesting papers, let me give you a very, very specific example and how I have come across this particular paradox or question. So you might remember a few weeks ago, I showed you my personal CRM application. Now, the way it works is it does use large language models to analyze all sorts of information about my contacts. And some of this information is pretty complex. There's a lot of messages that I exchange with my contacts, but also I'm doing cross-contact analysis. I have over 800 contacts, so that's actually pretty significant when it comes to the number of queries, the number of prompts that go to a large language model. If I wanted to run the most expensive models available to me, that would be very, very expensive. It would probably go into hundreds of dollars, if not more, every month just to run this particular application. So that was obviously not something that I could afford. So what did I do? I decided to run most of the queries, most of the analysis using the cheapest models that I have access to. And then for some of my most important contacts, I have an option to manually trigger the more advanced models to analyze them, right? So the absolute majority of my contacts get analyzed with cheaper models. The most important ones get analyzed with the most powerful ones, extended thinking, web search, and so on and so on. Now, the interesting part is after running this application for several weeks now, I literally cannot tell the difference between the analysis that's performed by the cheaper models and by those more advanced ones with advanced thinking on, those that are more expensive. And so I thought maybe I'm just not able to see that, but turns out that recent research seems to be indicating, and there's growing body of research in that space, seems to be indicating that indeed some of the reasoning that those systems perform for us is performative. Literally, they perform something that's just performative. Or as some researchers call it, it's a reasoning theater. So two papers that I wrote about in the most recent newsletter. The first one is called When AI Shows Its Work, Is It Actually Working? A very, very recent paper published on arXiv literally just about a week ago. The researchers have analyzed 10 frontier models, so some of the more advanced or the most advanced models for different task types. And what I've noticed is that they figured out a pretty smart way of removing some of the reasoning steps from the analysis and then comparing the outcomes. And on average, when I looked at the paper, those reasoning tasks would have a number of steps, say 3 steps or 5 steps. Those researchers found out that removing a single step from that reasoning task, from that reasoning process, changes the outcome of the reasoning only in 17% of cases. And so what they were able to show that pretty much in every situation that they were analyzing, those individual reasoning steps were not necessary. Yes, they did show different types of reasoning tasks where those steps are more important, and then they showed different types that are less important. So kind of the idea here is that there are some relatively simple tasks like summarizing a document, which do not require a lot of reasoning, and so those reasoning steps are definitely not important there. So there was one paper, 17% of the time every single step was important for the reasoning. The second paper, called Reasoning Theater, I love the name, Reasoning Theater, the researchers again found a way of analyzing the behavior of a large language model, and so they could get a good sense of when, in their view, the model was reaching a level of confidence before producing a response that any further reasoning would not change that response anymore. And so they were running experiments once again, and for some of those large language models, they were stopping the reasoning at the point where they believed the model has reached a level of confidence that would allow it to produce the answer without further reasoning. Turns out those researchers were able to show that stopping those reasoning tasks early led to between 30 and 80% of savings in tokens. Token is a unit of analysis for those large language models, and if you're using those large language models through APIs, application programming interfaces, you will normally be paying per token. And so, producing just a couple of words, normally it's just a few tokens, but if you add a reasoning behind that, that could generate dozens, if not hundreds of tokens, depending on how deep that reasoning goes. So there are tokens that you pay for, which are the sort of representing the output of the work of the large language model. And then there are tokens that you also pay for that are representing the amount of work happening behind the scenes. Turns out that in most cases, those reasoning tokens cost you just as much as those output tokens. And so back to the research, if the researchers were showing that in some cases they were able to save 80% of those reasoning tokens, this means theoretically that in some cases you would be paying only a fifth of what you would normally pay, and you would still get the same results. This is the reasoning theater. This is the performative reasoning for the show. The model does not really need to do this additional reasoning, but because we, the users, are requesting the deep thinking, the extended thinking, or whatever it's being called in the user interface, it will perform that analysis. Sounds like a waste of money, and in many cases it is a waste of money. And so my point this week is for you to start asking yourself, do I really need that deep reasoning? Or perhaps if my model is doing the deep reasoning, if I compared it to another model that doesn't do deep reasoning, am I getting really any better results? Or is it just me thinking that I'm going to throw the most advanced model and then I'm going to get better results? Turns out this might be exactly the same. There's a lot of organizations that proudly share how many tokens they use in their analysis. I think OpenAI gave an award to a consultancy. I don't remember which consultancy it was, doesn't really matter. I think it was the first organization that used 1 billion tokens in the use of OpenAI. Look, this is insane. This is like talking about how good your car is by saying how much fuel you're using. That's not the way of measuring the efficiency of those LLMs. You want to talk about the quality of the outputs, you want to talk about the actual change that those systems generate, and not how many tokens they're using. This is a bit of a perverse measure, because obviously if you're being proud of how many tokens you have used, it means that you don't really care how much you pay for the analysis, for the work of those large language models, and you also don't really care about the efficiency of the use of those. So a couple of implications here. If you are smart about this, if you start questioning whether you need those deep reasoning tokens for some of your tasks, you might be saving money. The task for you for next week or after you've listened to this podcast is to take whatever the typical analysis that you do using a large language model, assuming that you're doing it with extended thinking, with chain of thought reasoning, and then turn that chain of thought reasoning off and try to compare the results. In some cases, you'll notice that the outputs are pretty much the same, and so you should then be more careful about turning that extended thinking on. The other implication that I wanted to highlight is that we all think that those cloud-based models delivered by companies like Anthropic, OpenAI are the best ones, and the open models that we could download to our local machines and run on local machines are not as good because with our computing power, we're not able to go into those deep levels of reasoning. Well, turns out maybe we don't have to. Maybe those slower, locally running models will run just as long without reasoning as those cloud-based models run online with reasoning. But the outputs might be exactly the same. So, a slower model, but the same output. And of course, the local one would be way, way cheaper for you to use, if not completely free. And so this is the challenge. This is the provocation for this week. Whenever you're using your chatbots, your large language models, your AI systems for your tasks, ask yourself, do I really need the most powerful AI available to humanity? Do I need to turn extended thinking, chain of thought reasoning on? Or perhaps I'm going to be just as well off with a not as advanced model without chain of thought reasoning. Perhaps I do not have to hire the world's best scientist to help me decide what to have for dinner on a Friday. Stay curious and see you next week.